utterances in the Old Testament are still, they're still moments. You know what I'm saying? Those moments happened in real time. David is feeling what he is feeling in Psalm 22. It's not just that David says, or God gives David this sense of, oh, here's some things you need to write down so that my son can say them at the time of crucifixion. David is in the moment experiencing these feelings in Psalm 22. So Psalm 22 qualifies as a lament. And if you guys remember when we broke down the laments, there was personal or corporate, or personal or community. And this is a personal lament. This is not about Israel. This is about David and how he feels. And it falls under book 1 of the Psalms, which, if you guys remember, goes probably about the first 50 Psalms or so are in book 1. And obviously it is a Psalm of David. If someone would, let's read, a brave volunteer to read Psalm 22 verses 1 through 18, and that's where we're going to start this morning. So a lot of the reading of Psalm 22 should sound really familiar to us if we're familiar with the words of Christ Jesus on the cross. And when I read Psalm 22, the other chapter in the Bible that really kind of jumps out at me is Isaiah 53, where, that's a chapter that really deals with the crucifixion of Christ, and probably my favorite verse out of that chapter is, by his wounds we are healed, or if you're a fan of the band Stryper, by his stripes we are healed, referring to the lashes that he would receive. So Psalm 22, the first 18 verses, really, there's this incredibly strong connection to what Jesus will endure on the cross and his reaction to that situation. Right. Mm-hmm. Yep. No, you're fine. I actually watched a video last night, and it's these two guys that are obviously kind of it's a youth and a worship pastor, if you will, right? They're not our folks, and they've got a little video on YouTube, and they said there's like 3 things that happened in that episode with David and Goliath that are really interesting. For one thing, it says that David carried 5 stones with him into that encounter. Well, if David had faith, why did he need 5 stones? But Goliath had 4 brothers. Okay? So he's got 1 for each of you, right? Doc Holliday? The other thing the other 2 things that happened that they said that was and we're kind of getting off the beaten path here, but you brought it up, so I'm going to run with it. The second thing was that David had confidence, because how he refers to Goliath at the beginning of that episode is this uncircumcised Philistine, okay? And rather, that's not a physical characteristic of Goliath. What their point was that David, by calling him uncircumcised, knew that Goliath was not in a covenant relationship with God. So how did David know he was going to win? He knew that God wasn't with him. God was with David. And the third thing is that David used a sling. And if you look in guys with, in one-on-one combat, right, you don't see a bunch of guys with slings out there. So why did David use the sling? And it was because that was the tool with which he had been equipped by God. That was the tool that was his gift. That was what he was familiar with. That is what God had brought him up with. And their point on this, and I thought this was a great point, was that too often in our lives, we look at what's going on around us, and we look at other people's gifts, and we go, why did we get that? Why aren't I blessed like that? Instead of looking at what God has done for each of us. Sometimes we give ourselves too hard a time about that. Like you said, we point David's faults, and too often we do the same thing to ourselves, right? We focus on our faults and how we are not worthy before God. Brothers and sisters, no matter how good I am for the last however many years I've got left on this earth, I'm not going to be able to be justified before God. And God is okay with that if my heart is seeking Him. And one of the things that ought to encourage us out of Psalm 22, what you just read, James, there are some things that when I was a younger Christian, I would not have dared to say to God. I didn't have the faith. I didn't think I could say to God, and I remember the first time that I really looked at Psalm 22, I looked at Psalm 22 and I said, that's blasphemy. I can't believe he said that. God is okay when we are crying out to Him. When we feel separated from God, part of that process of bringing us back to Him is a cry, an acknowledgement that we might feel forsaken. I look at everything God did for David. This is one of those things I'm telling you, the guys that talk about the episode in 2 Samuel are telling you not to do, but I'm looking at David going, well, man, David, if I was blessed like you and I was the Lord's anointed, I wouldn't ever feel forsaken by God. So let's talk about these quotes from Psalm 22, and we'll break it down and show you the New Testament reference for where they're at. And the first one is this: my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, far from the words of my groaning? Does anybody else have another version that uses a different word than groaning? From my anguish? I think maybe it's the King James that uses the word roaring. Might be the RSV. But, this groaning, this isn't this is that scream of agony, right? This is And then in the ninth hour in Matthew 27:46, about the ninth hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, or thani, lama sabachthani. That is my God, why have you forsaken me? So you see that? Everybody seeing what we're doing here? Okay. In you our fathers trusted, in verse 4. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried and were rescued. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. And in Matthew 27, those who look at Jesus on the cross say he trusts in God. Let God deliver him now if he desires him. So there's, again, these fulfillments, if you will, but think of them as references, right? Usually, I say usually, what I did with Psalm 23, I had that list of songs, and when I'm reading Psalm 22, couldn't see a song, could not make a song reference. Verse 6 does it for us. I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and desired and despised by the people. What song, ironically, does anybody catch the song reference in? Alas, and did my Savior bleed, and did my sovereign die? Would he devote that sacred head for such a worm as I? Right. And some of our modern editors, arrangers have decided that worm is just too strong a word, and they have changed it to such a one as I. And yet, if you're really focused on what's happening here at the cross, they spit on him. They took the reed and struck him on the head, and when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe and put on his own clothes and led him away to crucify him in verse 30 of Matthew 27. So there's your song reference. The only song reference and like I said, it didn't hit me until you read it, and I went, hello. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me and they wag their heads. And Matthew 27 and Mark 15 both record those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. What's the mock here? Well, in verse 35, when the people stood by watching, but the rulers scoffed at him, saying, he saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Christ of God, his chosen one. What are they saying? You're not the one. If you are who you say you are, you'll either save yourself or God will save. And we can't understand first off, we can't understand the power. We don't understand the authority. We don't understand all of the resources at his beck and call at any moment in his life, but especially at this moment in his life. And James, I don't understand how a man endures that and doesn't call on it. Because if they're dragging me away, we ain't getting to the point of the cross. I'm not enduring the pain. As soon as I realize what the game is, I'm doing everything in my power to stop it. And that's the human reaction. But what does he say you got to do to get there? You got to take up your cross and follow me. So, one of the things, it doesn't talk about until you get to the very, very end, and he suffered everything physically. But that point of pressure, the irony of the name of Gethsemane, right? Does anybody? I did a sermon. It's been years ago, but I did a sermon, and in the does anybody remember what the name Gethsemane literally means? It means place of crushing, because that was where the olive press was. On the Gethsemane's on the Mount of Olives. It's an olive grove, and Gethsemane, that specific garden, was where they crushed those olives. And it is also where he's being crushed. The hardest part of this process was getting to the point where he could say, not my will, but thine be done. Because his prayer at that point, the first part of that prayer is, Lord, if this cup can pass, please let it pass. The crucifixion was not something that Jesus said, man, I'm looking forward to fulfilling all that David said. The crucifixion was something that he knew would be more than he could bear. So the hardest part of that was in the garden when because he's yielded up his life, and everything else is happening to him, but he's mentally made that choice to get there. And like I said, man, if it's me in the garden, I'm looking at Peter going, why didn't you bring two swords? Because that's Ken Butler. Yes, sir.
What's the difference in the scoffing there that they done to our Savior? We say that us going out here and taking words, if the word didn't say that, we put a homosexual female in the pulpit and say it's all right. I'm not talking about our church, I understand. But we do that if we don't say anything about it, it's being wrong for fear of retaliation.
Roy, if there's any good news, it is that I don't have to be right about everything. I don't have to be right about everything. Now, I'm not saying that if your mentality is, I'm going to make a mockery of God's word, if that is your intent and purpose, then we got a heart problem. That's a symptom of a bigger problem. Does that make sense? Okay. You don't know how close to home this hits. My best friend serves under that bishop. The guy that did my wedding, the guy that pronounced us man and wife, serves under that bishop. Again, if our attitude is to put someone in a place that because the attempt is to make a mockery of God and what God's commands are, then we have a heart problem. We're rejecting, and we are we're blaspheming God. Okay? And if that's your purpose. If you're, and brother, I'm not telling you I'm not going to go listen to her preach. Not going to do it. Because I do have a sensibility about what this says and what we should and shouldn't do. But I don't think Todd serves under Buddy. Is that? I don't even know her name. Are y'all understanding the reference I'm trying to make here? The lady that did the National Day of Prayer. And so, you know, he is in the Washington area. No longer a member of the Churches of Christ. He's part of the. He's ordained in the Episcopal Church. I don't think that he is putting her up there because of what she represents. You understand what I'm saying? He's not serving in her diocese because of he believes that it's important to have all the qualifications that she doesn't have to be in that position. She has supported him in his. He basically had a group of people in charge of that congregation, and he's brought in as their priest, and he had a war on his hands. And this lady supported him. And that's no, I got you, but it's hard for me because I do disagree with her being in that position. I read this and I don't see how I would make that choice. But when you said it's not within our churches, man, we had lunch with David Edmonds 3 weeks ago. And Dave Edmonds was a member at Highland Oaks. I don't know if you guys know this, but that congregation had one of people with those qualifications, you know what I'm saying, fell into those categories that you're talking about on their staff at Highland Oaks. So it's not, it's a dangerous thing for us to look at other churches, other religious organizations, and rip them because within our own brotherhood, we're struggling with those same issues. Oh, no, we said something. We said, give us Barabbas. Yeah, no, I got you. No, but I think you give us too much credit. I don't think the congregation, if you're looking back and read this in the account in Matthew 27, the congregation's not silent. Pilate gave us the choice and said, who do you want? And we know what we said? Give us Barabbas. Give us the murderer. Give us the thief. Give us the guy that's going to bring problems upon us. Sorry, I made you get that phone call.
The Bible says what it says, and we're independent congregations.
Mm-hmm.
Self-governing, independent churches are the body of Christ, the overall body of Christ. Still, we're independent. And it's our job to preach the word. Okay? And not be condemning other people, but trying to lead them into what the Bible says and let God do the condemning. That's his job.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be judged by what Jesus said. And so, we recognize by their fruit sin in people's lives. But it's our job to go to them and try to show them what the Scripture says.
And the one thing I would add to that is that when we're teaching the truth, it must be done in love. And too often,
You cannot tell them they're going to hell and walk off.
or tell them you're right, and they're even to the point of telling them you're right. One of the things that I heard, my aunt told me a story the other day. Yesterday was my brother's birthday, and my brother and I, we can't talk. Because if I tell him something, no matter how I say it, he receives it as me talking down to him. Okay? Doesn't matter what it is. And so anyway, one of the things that we talked about was this: we have lost an ability in our society to disagree with somebody and disagree lovingly. Okay? Now my youngest brother has that ability. If there's one thing I would say about my youngest brother Kevin, he likes to argue for the argument's sake. He likes, because he thinks he's learning something, or hopefully he's teaching you something. But at the end of the day, he and I love each other. Now, in our society, when we start to lose the argument, it becomes personal. And we lose the ability to disagree because because it turns personal. We tell them they're going to hell. We tell them you're in scriptural error, and if you knew the Bible better, you'd make a better choice than that. Well, if that's your approach in talking to people, right? And yes, that's what we're seeing here. But what we are called to be is the victim. And that's hard. It is hard for us to put ourselves in a position where we are the ones that are humble. But if you read Philippians chapter 2, and we will, that's what you're called to do. Jesus says, David says in verse 14, I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, and it's melted within my breast. And some of the scholars look at John 19 and the incident of the soldier piercing his side, and blood and water flowed as a condition of his heart having melted and being poured out like water. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. After this, Jesus, knowing all was now finished, said, I thirst. And do you see how the references are getting shorter? Because he physically can't quote like he was at the beginning of the process, right? As this process has gone on, he can only say, I thirst, because of how grueling and intense the price that had to be paid. One of the things that I've said repeatedly, when you look at the Old Testament and you look at the crucifixion, sin is a messy business. And it takes a great deal of personal sacrifice. Not on our part. but on our Savior's part. Verse 16, he says, "For dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me." Now, at the back half of that, "They have pierced my hands and feet." And so what's bolded here is what we're looking at in Matthew 27. "The chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus." Then the soldiers, down to verse 27, "The soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole battalion before him." So you see this being encompassed and being surrounded by the evildoers there. "They have pierced my hands and feet." And when they had mocked him in Matthew 27, verse 31, when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him and led him away to crucify him. And when they crucified him, they divided his garments among them by casting lots. And then in John 19, "They will look on him whom they have pierced." Verse 17 says, "I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me." So those are the words of David. When they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. And do y'all understand that reference? Do y'all understand what they're talking about here? So the Romans had figured out how to make crucifixion really painful. So when the Romans go back a couple of hundred years, 200 BC, when they first started this process, they wouldn't pierce the people's feet. They would just pierce their hands. Well, after a certain amount of time, when your body sags and your hands are like this, you can't breathe. So what the Romans did to make this a more agonizing process was they would push them up and nail their feet in place so that when your body naturally, you don't want that next breath. This is something you want over with. And so the piercing of the feet would force your body to push up on that where your feet are pierced, where they're driven into the stake, and it would make that process go longer. And it's why Pilate, if you read in some of the passages, in some of the gospel accounts, Pilate surprised he's passed away. He's dead already. So what the Romans did when they get tired of the show and they're ready for it to be over, they'd take a big hammer and they'd come by and break their legs, and that would be what collapsed them and would end the process. And they didn't do that with Jesus. Right. Well, that's for the Jewish tradition. That was for the Pentecost. The Romans, there's a couple of things that the Romans did that the Jews, that sound like they're Jewish things. When the Romans scourged Jesus, it's not the scourging that Paul gets. Paul says, however many times I've received the 40 less one, right? So when the Jews scourged a person or when they whipped a person, the Jews would always stop at 39, right? So that you didn't exceed 40, because 40 was the commandment, okay? Kind of like why you get a baker's dozen, right? The bakery doesn't want to be accused of shorting somebody a donut, so what do? Some of them would give you 13 instead of 12. So the Jews, now the Romans didn't have that account. So when Jesus gets scourged, it doesn't stop at 40. The Romans scourged until the whip couldn't find its mark anymore. So, and in this, the Romans were not, if it had been a Roman crucifixion somewhere else besides Judea, right? The Romans would have left them up there. The accounts of crucifixion, what was that Roman slave that led the revolt? Spartacus. When Spartacus led it, those guys hung on those crosses for weeks because Rome was making a statement. And the reason that Rome wouldn't do that in Jerusalem was if you'd have left them up during the holiday, then the Jews might have revolted. So Pilate was not, and the Roman governors before him, they weren't, on some things they were trying to honor, right? They're trying to keep the peace in Jerusalem. Okay, so they divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. And Matthew 27 says, when they had crucified him, they divided his garments among them. So that is again, first, those 18 verses that James read at the beginning of class, those are the ones that we have the most connection to that. And as you read those words, can you see the difference in David's countenance between Psalm 22 and Psalm 23? Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd and I shall not want. Psalm 22 starts with, my God, why have you forsaken me? So we get to verse 19, and there starts to be a transition in where David is. He's now asking God to not be far off. There's a reference to this in verse 11. Verse 11, he says, be not far from me, for trouble is near and there is none to help. And then it talks about the many bulls of Bashan surrounding him. So again, he's this 19, we're making this appeal like we did in verse 11. Psalm 74, in verse 4, the prayer is to rescue me from the hand of the wicked. So over and over in the Psalms, you see this cry out to God because we can't help ourselves. We need God. And it's hard for us to admit we need, right? I want to be self-sufficient. Okay? My neighbor, I tried to drive my car to work with a flat, and I don't know, it doesn't work. Just if you can learn, if I can help you anyway, if that tire's flat, don't try to limp it. Just do something else. So I limped it out. I limped it back into the right, and all the kids that are waiting on the bus saw me leave, and then saw me come back with a flat tire. Yeah, it was awesome. So I took Danetta's car to work, come back from work, and I'm gonna change my tire because I'm a self-sufficient American man, and I'm out there. My neighbor comes out and he sees me trying to hook up my little mini 19-volt cordless drill to try to do the tires, right? Try to get the lugs off of it. He comes out with a 1/2-inch power drill. It was awesome. And yes, it helped. It went quickly, and I got my tires off, and I got it changed. But I felt insufficient, and I now need a 1/2-inch power drill. Okay? So it's hard for us to say that we need someone to provide for us. It is hard for us, right? It's why it's so important for us to be able to pray, Lord, give us this day our daily bread. When in truth, part of us says we want to be the ones doing it. All right, so he's going to tell the name of God in the congregation, that he has not hidden his face from him, but he has heard when he cried to him. Verse 24. From you comes my praise in the great congregation. I'm going to verse 29 because we've been talking about all these prophetic things that are filled up. Read verse 29 says, all the prosperous of the earth eat and worship. Before him shall bow all who go down to the dust, even the one who could not keep himself alive. And this goes back to what I told you, Philippians 2, we were coming to this. This is where I want to end this morning. Paul writes of Jesus, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. All who go down shall bow. And when the resurrection comes, and on Christ's return, every knee shall bow. It's better to be one who has called him Lord before he had to prove it.